Goldie Hawn just quietly exposed a truth about working with Rob Reiner that Hollywood was never supposed to notice. For decades, Goldie Hawn said nothing. No dramatic interviews. No behind-the-scenes exposes. No subtle jabs buried in late-night talk show humor. Just silence. And in Hollywood, silence is rarely accidental. Then, in what seemed like an ordinary moment, she calmly reflected on her experience working with Rob Reiner, and the industry leaned in. Because what she described wasn't scandal. It wasn't shouting matches or explosive fights. It was something quieter, harder to prove, harder to name. And that's exactly why it matters. Erased the part most people missed. Goldie didn't accuse. She didn't dramatize. She didn't rewrite history. Instead, she described an atmosphere, a feeling, a shift that happened so gradually she didn't even recognize it at first. On the surface, everything looked ideal. Meetings were professional. Conversations were respectful. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices. Rob Reiner carried himself with certainty, calm, decisive, steady. The kind of confidence Hollywood often rewards. The kind that keeps productions moving. At first, she admired it. Strong direction can feel reassuring in a chaotic, creative environment. When someone speaks clearly and moves the room forward, it creates momentum. Decisions get made. Time isn't wasted. Projects stay on track. But hey, race where the story turns. Goldie began noticing something subtle. Whenever Rob spoke, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations naturally aligned with his perspective. Ideas slowly bent toward his framework. No one was forced. No one was silenced. It just happened. And gradually, she began adjusting. She hesitated before offering a different opinion. She softened her suggestions. She let certain thoughts stay unspoken. Not because she lacked ideas. Not because she was afraid. But because pushing against that steady certainty began to feel unnecessary, almost disruptive. That's the hidden detail no one talks about in Hollywood power dynamics. Influence doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks polite. And hey, race the question that lingers. When does leadership quietly become dominance? Goldie later reflected that there was no single moment where she chose silence. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was incremental, meeting after meeting, small adjustments, tiny concessions, each one barely noticeable. Until one day, speaking up felt like the exception instead of the rule. What makes this story powerful isn't conflict. It's the absence of it. No villain, no public feud, just a slow internal shift. She described it as feeling smaller without understanding why. That realization didn't come immediately. For years, she told herself this was normal, that this is simply how large creative projects function. Strong personalities lead, others adapt. That's professionalism. But now, looking back, she sees the pattern. And the deeper question isn't about Rob Reiner at all. It's about what happens in rooms where confidence goes unquestioned. Because when one voice consistently sets the direction, others don't need to be silenced. They begin to silence themselves. And that was only the beginning.
You don't understand. There are only 3 ages for women in Hollywood. Babe, district attorney, and driving Miss Daisy.
At first, nothing felt wrong. That's what makes this part unsettling. When Goldie Hawn looked back, she didn't point to a blow-up or a humiliating confrontation. There was no explosive clash with Rob Reiner. No headline-worthy fallout. Instead, she traced everything back to one completely ordinary meeting. A room full of talented people. Scripts spread across a table. Coffee cups half finished. Ideas moving quickly. It was the kind of creative session that happens every day in Hollywood. Everyone was contributing. Thoughts overlapped. Possibilities floated in the air. Then Rob spoke. Confident. Clear. Direct. He outlined his vision, structured the conversation, and suddenly the energy shifted. It wasn't forced. No one was ordered to agree. But the discussion began orbiting around him. Ideas that had been separate started aligning with his direction. Conversations accelerated. Decisions formed. Goldie watched it happen. At the time, she called it leadership. Strong direction. Efficiency. The kind of decisiveness that keeps a production from collapsing under indecision. But something small happened in that moment. She had an idea. A different angle. A creative adjustment that could have shifted the tone of the project. For a second, she prepared to share it. And then she hesitated. It wasn't fear. It wasn't intimidation. It was something quieter, a calculation. Would it change anything? Would pushing back slow things down? Would it make her look difficult in a room that seemed so aligned? So she let the moment pass. That single pause felt harmless. Mature even. Collaborative. The project moved forward. No tension. No friction. But Hay raced the detail she didn't understand until years later. That was the first time she chose silence over instinct. And it didn't feel like a loss at the time. That's the contradiction at the heart of this story. Nothing bad visibly happened. No one criticized her. Rob didn't dismiss her. In fact, he remained professional, measured, steady, which made it harder to question. Over the next few meetings, the pattern quietly repeated. Rob would articulate his perspective. The room would naturally align. And Goldie would weigh whether her contribution was worth disrupting the momentum. Sometimes she spoke and her ideas were acknowledged politely before being folded back into his larger framework. Other times, she simply stepped back before even beginning. And gradually, that internal calculation became automatic. Hay raced the rehook that changes everything. She began shrinking without realizing she was shrinking. There was no conscious decision, no dramatic inner monologue. Just adaptation, adjustment, efficiency. Hollywood rewards harmony. It rewards projects that move smoothly. It rewards people who are easy to work with. Goldie believed she was being exactly that. But over time, something subtle shifted inside her. Instead of asking, "Why isn't this idea being explored?" she began asking, "Am I overthinking this?" Instead of wondering whether the room needed more balance, she questioned her own instincts. That internal shift was the real turning point. Because once doubt becomes personal, it's no longer about the dynamic in the room, it's about your own confidence. And Rob never had to silence her. She started doing it herself. Looking back now, she describes that first meeting not as dramatic, but as defining. It was the moment she unknowingly learned the unspoken rules of the space. The moment she realized that strong certainty often sets the gravitational pull in creative rooms. And once that gravitational pull is established, challenging it feels like stepping out of orbit. The unsettling part? No one intended harm. No one planned imbalance. It was momentum pure, natural momentum built around one dominant presence. But momentum, left unchecked, reshapes everyone around it. And Goldie was only beginning to understand what that reshaping would cost her.
They always come to you first. So eventually it's going to wear on that man, and it really makes you feel terrible. So as the object of everyone's affection, you're always going, oh, and this is fun. And you're so torn and so pulled because there's so much going toward you and not enough going to your spouse.
For a long time, the silence felt strategic, professional, even wise. But there comes a moment in every long-running dynamic when the internal pressure becomes harder to ignore than the external harmony. For Goldie Hawn, that moment didn't arrive with fireworks. It came during another routine creative discussion with Rob Reiner. Same kind of room, same polished professionalism, same steady rhythm of ideas moving forward. Rob presented his vision clear, structured, confident as always. Heads nodded. The conversation began shaping itself around his outline almost immediately. But this time, something was different. Goldie felt the familiar instinct to step back and chose not to. Calmly, measured, without confrontation, she offered another perspective. Not an attack, not resistance for the sake of ego. A thoughtful, creative alternative. She explained her reasoning. She laid out the emotional tone she believed the project could explore. It was steady, grounded, experienced. For a brief second, the room paused. Rob listened. He responded respectfully. He acknowledged her point. Then, with the same calm authority, he restated his original direction, slightly reframed, subtly adjusted, and moved forward. The meeting ended without conflict. On paper, nothing dramatic happened. But Hay raced the rehook. Everything changed. Not in volume. In access. In the weeks that followed, Goldie noticed small shifts. Fewer early drafts crossing her desk. Fewer moments where she was consulted at the beginning of decisions. She was still included, still respected, but not as centrally positioned as before. There was no confrontation, no explicit message, no statement that she had crossed a line. But she felt it, and that realization unsettled her more than any argument could have, because it revealed something unspoken. Speaking up had a cost. Not punishment, not hostility, distance. She began replaying the meeting in her mind. Had she pushed too hard? Had her tone shifted? Was she reading too much into subtle changes? This is where the psychological shift deepened. Instead of asking whether the dynamic was balanced, she began questioning whether she had miscalculated the room. That's how powerful unspoken systems can be. They don't require enforcement. They operate through awareness. And once she sensed the boundaries, she became more cautious than ever. Hey Race, what makes this moment pivotal? It wasn't about losing an argument. Creative disagreements are normal. Goldie understood that. It was about understanding her real influence. She realized that her voice could be heard, but not necessarily centered. That challenging the gravitational pull of a strong personality didn't create chaos, but it did subtly reposition her. And that repositioning was quiet enough that no one could call it unfair. That's the contradiction. From the outside, the collaboration still looked seamless. Two respected Hollywood figures working professionally. No scandal. No tension visible to the public. But internally, Goldie began seeing the pattern clearly for the first time. Her earlier silence hadn't been accidental. It had been adaptive. And once she recognized that, she couldn't unsee it. Hey Race, the deeper layer most people overlook. Rob never changed his behavior dramatically. His confidence remained steady. His direction remained clear. The system functioned exactly as it always had. What changed was her awareness of it. And awareness is disruptive. Because once you recognize a dynamic, you have to decide whether to continue participating in it the same way. Goldie now describes that day as the turning point, not because of conflict, but because of clarity. She finally understood that power in a room doesn't need to be loud to be influential. It doesn't need to reject you outright to reduce your space. It simply needs to be steady enough that others begin adjusting around it. And she had been adjusting for years. The unsettling part? She wasn't sure anymore whether she had been collaborating or accommodating. That distinction would take much longer to unpack. And what she realized next would force her to look beyond Rob Reiner and directly at herself.
But when you take a problem, especially with a child, and you continue to imprint on their minds the negativity and the horror of the moment, then that's how their brain will remember it.
The most difficult truth Goldie Hawn had to face wasn't about Rob Reiner at all. It was about herself. Years after those meetings. Years after those subtle shifts in creative rooms. Years after the polite conversations and efficient collaborations. She began to see the pattern clearly, and it followed her beyond one director, beyond one project, beyond one partnership. That's the rehook no one expects. Rob wasn't the only strong personality she worked with. Hollywood is full of them. Visionaries, directors, producers, executives who speak with certainty and move entire rooms with a sentence. And she noticed something unsettling. Around similar personalities, she behaved the same way. She softened her tone, adjusted her ideas, measured her words more carefully than necessary, waited for the right opening instead of creating one. The dynamic had become internal. At some point, it stopped being about reacting to someone else's confidence. It became about anticipating it. That's when the reflection turned personal. Goldie realized she had gradually redefined professionalism as accommodation. She had convinced herself that harmony was more valuable than friction. That smooth meetings meant successful collaboration. That being easy to work with was a strength. And in many ways, it is. But hey Race, the contradiction. When harmony consistently requires one person to shrink, it stops being neutral. She began tracing the emotional cost. Every time she chose silence, it felt minor, insignificant, a small sacrifice for the sake of progress. But accumulated over years, those moments reshaped how she viewed her own voice. She started second-guessing instincts that once felt natural, questioning opinions she once delivered confidently, interpreting hesitation as maturity instead of warning. That internal shift was more powerful than any external pressure. And hey Race, what makes this revelation complex? She doesn't describe Rob as malicious. She doesn't frame him as controlling. She acknowledges his steadiness, his clarity, his ability to lead a room, which makes the story more uncomfortable, because it suggests that imbalance doesn't require cruelty. Sometimes it emerges from momentum. When one presence consistently sets direction and others consistently adapt, the pattern becomes self-sustaining. No one needs to enforce it. It simply operates. Goldie now describes that period not as conflict, but as conditioning, not imposed, learned. She learned when to lean in and when to step back. She learned which ideas would gain traction and which would dissolve. She learned the invisible boundaries of influence. And eventually, she recognized the most unsettling truth of all: no one had forced her to shrink. She had trained herself to. That awareness didn't spark anger. It sparked clarity. She began reevaluating what equal collaboration truly means. Whether politeness can sometimes mask imbalance. Whether leadership can unintentionally silence without ever raising its voice. And that's why this story resonates beyond one partnership. It speaks to every professional space where confidence goes unquestioned, where strong personalities unintentionally shape the behavior of everyone around them, where silence can look like agreement. Goldie didn't expose a scandal. She exposed a dynamic. And once you see it, you start recognizing it everywhere.
People would ask me when I was a little girl, they'd say to me, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And my answer was always happy.
What makes this reflection powerful isn't accusation, it's recognition. In an industry obsessed with dramatic conflicts and explosive revelations, Goldie Hawn offered something far more unsettling: a calm examination of how influence actually works behind closed doors. No shouting, no headlines, just the quiet evolution of a creative partnership that gradually shifted her sense of space in a room. Her story forces a larger question: how many collaborations in Hollywood and beyond operate under similar patterns? How often does confidence become gravity? How often do capable, experienced voices slowly adjust themselves without realizing it? What makes her honesty compelling is its restraint. She doesn't rewrite the past. She doesn't assign blame. She simply acknowledges that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives dressed as efficiency, as clarity, as leadership, and sometimes the cost of maintaining harmony is paid in silence. The unanswered question lingers. If she had recognized the pattern earlier, would anything have changed? Or is this dynamic so embedded in creative culture that most people accept it as normal? That's the part still echoing. Not what happened in those rooms, but how many other rooms feel exactly the same.
If you enjoy in-depth coverage of the stories shaping celebrity culture and entertainment, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay connected for the next big story.